Good day, everyone. And I can see we have people from several continents already, and people are coming in the door, and we're grateful for the interest, and we're just blessed having Professor Hudson here with his wide breadth of knowledge, not only in ancient economics but in the present day. And in my humble opinion, I feel Michael is certainly one of the leaders in the present day thinking of democracy and moving forward, and in the past too. So I'm honored, and we're very honored, I believe, to be in his presence. And thank you, Professor Hudson, for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Stephen.
I
was at the very first conference that Steve ever had, and I was at all the earlier conferences, so it's good to have continuity after all these years.
Yes, thank you. And in our recent interviews in the last 2 years, we've been covering the temples of enterprise, and we'll make some progress. I was in love with the early Bronze Age and Sumerian culture for its values. So we covered that in a little more detail. We covered labor, avoidance of war, silver and grain being used for money forward planning of administrators. And now in this talk, it's going to move on. And to prepare us for this talk, Professor Hudson will give us an overview. And you ready, Professor Hudson? And then we'll carry on with the Middle Bronze Age and everything else too. Thank you. And the present.
You want me to begin talking?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, Steve Zarlenga always insisted on distinguishing bank credit from money. And this had a very sound historical basis. From the Bronze Age origins in Mesopotamia, money was created as a means of paying debts. That is, settling credit balances that had mounted up during the crop year in the form of grain money, if you were a cultivator on the land, or for the advance of textiles and other goods to trade, if you were a trader and had to pay the palace or the temples in silver for what they had advanced to you. So to create a consolidated set of accounts so that they could make a balance sheet that would integrate the palace and the temple's foreign trade with its overall agricultural output that produced the grain to feed the weavers in the temple workshops and the palace bureaucracy, to make the textiles that were turned over to the traders to obtain foreign raw materials and silver. They had to have an overall balance sheet. And to make that balance sheet between grain and silver, they established a bimonetary standard of 1 unit of grain was equal to 1 shekel of silver. And this price control wasn't price control over the whole economy. It was a means of denominating transactions between the large institutions, the temples and the palace, and the economy at large, the family-based economy on the land. So what distinguishes the Bronze Age societies and early societies from what came later in the West was there were 2 sectors. There were the large institutions. We don't want to call them public institutions because they were self-contained. The public institutions had their own sphere of relationships and their own prices, and the economy at large, on the land and with foreign traders, had its rules, its common law. You had the laws of Hammurabi, referred to transactions between the economy at large and the palace, the large institutions. Whereas on the land, they had their own common law. That's very different from today's Western civilization. The job of the palace and the temples was to prevent the economy from falling into instability. There was a central coordinating power, and that was the job of the ruler. And the job was specifically to prevent a secular, privatized creditor oligarchy from developing. And that was the big difference that enabled civilization to take off for thousands of years, the third millennium, second millennium, first millennium, instead of polarizing in the way that Greece and Rome did. So when the reason that I think we're talking about the ancient Middle East today and the how different their society was precisely because they solved the problem that our current epoch has not solved. How do you deal with the problem of debts growing beyond the ability to be paid? What do you do when there's a crop failure? The whole economy of Mesopotamia operated on credit. That Stephen Zerlanga made a whole point of rejecting the views of Menger that said, well, money was created out of barter to buy goods and services. So when you went to a local shoemaker or to buy something or other, you'd just, I guess, pull grain out of your pocket and hope that it didn't go bad. But except that Menger didn't realize that the grain was money at that time. He only thought of silver as if everybody carried it around. Well, that's completely fictitious. Money was only used once a year for the agricultural sector, and that was when the crops were in on the threshing floor. The grain would be weighed out, and that was at the point where the grain became used as the monetary denomination that was used to pay all the credit and the debts that had accumulated during the year for families going and having a beer at the ale house, or to paying a priest for officiating at ceremonies, funerals or marriages, and all that. And the what made the economy of Mesopotamia different was, what do you do when the crops failed or when they fall short? What do you do when there's a drought or a flood or a military disturbance? Well, they realized that unlike today, they were not going to say, well, if the cultivator cannot pay the debt, then the creditor gets to foreclose. Tell the cultivator, you're now my bond servant. Give me your animals, any cattle you have, and ultimately turn over your land to me so that I and my fellow creditors can become an oligarchy, owning the land and all of the income. This would have been suicide. And if civilization in the third millennium, second millennium, had taken off in the way that the Austrians imagined, civilization never would have taken off, because you would have very quickly the decline of the Roman Empire would have occurred within about a century in the mid third millennium, and there wouldn't have been any takeoff. There'd just be chronic stagnation. So the whole fiction that was made up by the Austrians essentially to fight socialism is disproven by Mesopotamia. That's why economists don't talk about antiquity and Mesopotamia. If they talked about ancient Mesopotamia, they'd be talking about the unthinkable. They'd be talking about an alternative to the way that we're doing our things today and the way in which our modern society is organized along creditor lines. And essentially, what Mesopotamia did, Sumer, Babylonia, Assyria, all of their neighbors, was to make money and money management, credit and debt management, a public utility. It was not privatized. And there was always an oversight. And if you're making money and credit and the means of paying debts a public utility, then the fact that most of the population are debtors means you have to, above all, sustain the viability of the domestic cultivators on the land. And you do this by not forcing them into debt bondage, by not forcing them to lose their land and forfeit it to the creditors, and to remain independent on the land. No, that's supposed to be exactly what modern democracy is all about, benefiting society at large and preventing the status of individuals from being squeezed and deteriorating. That's essentially what's happening in the Western economies today, certainly from the United States to Europe. Societies couldn't afford that. They couldn't afford a creditor class monopolizing the land and taking control of labor, and labor losing its ability to support itself and perform its public services of serving in the military and performing corvée labor. So essentially, the what makes the study of Mesopotamian economic history so abhorrent to the mainstream economists is that society worked very well keeping money and credit in the hands of the palace and the temple rulers that acted as public managers in a way, whose job was committed to maintaining economic balance. That concept of balance has been lost in today's world. And so the whole reason of looking for Mesopotamia is you see that, well, today we have China that is keeping money creation and credit allocation in the hands of the Bank of China, in the hands of the government. You could say that something very akin to that was existed at the takeoff of economic civilization in the ancient Near East. And you had an ethic of rulership being designed to advance and protect the population at large. Something similar occurred in China. We don't have the documentation for China that we have in Mesopotamia, but we know from all of the Confucian rules and the rules of the early dynasties that the emperor's job was to keep the peasantry happy and not revolting. And a bad ruler would be one that was overthrown by the peasants because he didn't protect them from the emergence of an oligarchy. Well, if you were going to use that ethic today, you could say the whole Western economies have been taken over by bad rulers who let the creditors, let the bankers, let the financial sector, the landlords, all of the rentier sectors essentially take over the economy and stifle it. That's what makes the takeoff of civilization so fascinating. And the question is, how did they do it? And why did they stop doing it when they, after the Dark Age came in around 1200 BC, 500 years, and when you have classical Greece and Rome emerging from it, it was something entirely different without any of these safeguards. That's the big picture that I want to talk about. And I think Steve has been making some questions to illustrate all of these.
Yeah. In as we move then, Michael, from Sumeria to into the Middle Bronze Age and the period of Babylonia, there is a shift and a weakening, if you will, of this Sumerian system or this carrying system. And there's a could you describe, like, say, in terms of land tenure, in terms of property, how this weakening takes place in the Middle Ages? Where does the downfall, where does it begin to become apparent there?
Well, you have to look at the origins of land tenure, and that probably occurred in the late Neolithic period. There was plenty of land. The factor of production in short supply was labor. Everybody, every group wanted labor and they had to attract it. If a local city or state or tribe did not support the population at large and its independence and self-sufficiency, they'd run away. So you had flight. Emigration, you would say today, was always an option. And so any society had to decide, okay, how do we arrange access to the land? And if we're an irrigated society, how do we, who's going to do all the labor for digging all of the irrigation canals? And who's going to build the walls that cities need to defend themselves against other countries or other cities that would like to attack us? And how are we going to get raw materials that don't exist in the soil of Mesopotamia? It's very rich soil deposited by rivers and silt, like much of the Egyptian soil, but it didn't have metal or rocks or even large trees. So the idea was that you would have the rulers sort of set out and design a community, and they would lay out the land, make a map of it, and they would distribute the land to the population. It wasn't a settler state. It wasn't done, grab whatever you can, and if you want, just kill the people who are already on it and take it. Everybody was assigned a standardized lot that was deemed necessary for them to, at first, serve in the army and perform corvée labor. We've discussed this before, or in time to pay the taxes. So the allocation of land tenure, I won't say ownership, but the land tenure, the conditions by which the population occupied the land was all set up on a fairly egalitarian basis. It was according to what the society needed for, as we would say, taxes. Well, they didn't think of it as taxes. They didn't call it necessarily that. They called it the you have to serve in the army, or during the season that you're not planting and harvesting crops. That's when you work on public building for the public sector. That's when you dig the canals locally, and that's when you build the city walls or you build the temples, and we have all sorts of cylinder seals illustrated by workers, including the ruler, carrying on their head a big basket full of earth to move all the earth around to undertake all of this digging. They're huge construction projects, and this was had to be done voluntarily, because if it wasn't voluntary for the population to perform this construction labor and pretty heavy work, as I said, they would emigrate. They just leave and go somewhere else where they were able to make a land, because a living for themselves and support a family, because there was plenty of land everywhere for it. And so it was taxes that created land, whereas you have modern economics and political parties saying, well, the landowner should just have the land. Taxes are an intrusion onto the land. The whole idea of land tenure and taxes were symbiotic, went together from the very beginning. And it was taxes that determined the distribution and allocation of the land, the size of the land plots. And this allocation was considered to be the basic order on which society as a whole, the economy, but more than the economy, the whole society was based. The idea was to preserve this ability of families to become self-supporting on the land and still perform their public functions, both of corvée labor and military functions. And that essentially was the opposite of a free market in land where everybody could somehow join a grab bag, a free-for-all, competing for land, and especially by getting other cultivators and occupants into debt so that you could appropriate their land. This could be done on a temporary basis. If somebody got sick in the family or was injured or for any reason had wanted to have a big feast to celebrate a marriage or a funeral or some rite of passage, then they would have to work off the debts. In other words, they'd have to work for the creditor. The creditor was often a member of the palace and the uh, temple bureaucracy itself. And the obviously the ruler wanted to prevent members of the large institutions from becoming a private sector oligarchy. And you could say, well, okay, the debtor is going to have to work off the debt for a given number of years, but after that, there's going to be, it's not going to be lifetime. He may have to pay the debt in crops to the creditor. But at a certain point, he has to have control of the crops to pay for what he needs from the temple and palace and new goods and services, or just to feed themselves. And so we need a clean slate. We've discussed all that in the past. The fact that you had needed continual economic renewal. Today, that would be called a debt write-down, or it would be called a revolutionary redistribution of land, such as Mao's revolution in 1945. But it didn't take a revolution. This was considered as a normal state of affairs. There wasn't any Margaret Thatcher or Milton Friedman to go back in time and explain to Hammurabi and other rulers, here's how to organize a society in a free market that we like to call democracy. Nothing like that happened. And in fact, I don't think that rulers in the Bronze Age could even imagine how a society could be organized along the lines that today's economies are organized on and not immediately become stifled. Well, it takes a long time to be stifled, and stifling always takes longer than you'd expect. But the Western civilization doesn't have any central power to preserve the prosperity of the people at large. And even though that's supposed to be the objective of democracies, it's not the objective of oligarchies. And what the West calls democracy is what Aristotle said was an oligarchy. Aristotle said that most constitutions claim to be democracies, but they're really oligarchies. Well, that's really what Western civilization is, but nobody has a word, a political word, to describe just what do you call the Mesopotamian civilization. People didn't vote for a policy. There was no party conflict between, well, are we going to have a free market? Are we going to have a strong enough ruler to maintain order by proclaiming clean slates? It seemed obvious that if you're going to run society in a way that keeps the community growing and attracts people from other communities instead of having your own citizens run away, this is the way to do it. And it was a common way of looking that spans all sorts of different linguistic and ethnic divisions throughout the whole Bronze Age.
Yeah.
So, I'll give it to you in a second, Randy. So that in the middle Bronze Age, or in Babylonian times around 1700 BC, there's though comparison to 1,000 years earlier, there's a little more tension though, and there's a little more like the administrators might be trying to build up their condos in the urban areas, so to speak, or trying to take advantage, or little chiefdoms trying to get more what might be fair for society. And there's a little bit of a breakdown though in the Middle Ages, or in the middle Bronze Age. That's right, right?
These breakdowns are called intermediate periods. And what's an intermediate period? It means that there's a disruption, and the disruption often came from the fact that you had the nomadic tribes erupt, growing and moving into Mesopotamia, just like you had nomadic tribes move into Europe for over the next 4,000 years. You had the Mongolians, the Hungarians moved into Western Europe in the Middle Ages. You always had threats. And sometimes you would have these tribes would indeed take over and conquer the local cities because they had horses, they were skilled warriors, and they were much more militarily strong than many of the early cities. But when they took over, the question is, how are they going to run society? Well, they faced exactly the same problem and challenge that the earlier rulers had. You have to keep society functioning. So by the time you get to the late Bronze Age, and you have, for instance, Babylonia being conquered by the Persians left the Babylonians to administer their own economy. Just like when you had the Mongolians and the Hungarians, you had all the movements from the east militarily taking over Russia and Central Europe. They had to keep the momentum of the existing means of production, the social organization in place. Otherwise, what they took over would all fall apart. And if it fell apart, they couldn't pay the tribute. And what the conquerors wanted really wasn't to become rulers and take over domestic society. They just wanted tribute to themselves to be paid. They were not religiously intolerant. There was nothing like Christianity at that time, saying, if you don't believe our religion that our ethnicity believes, we're going to kill you and impose it on you, and you're not allowed to have your own religion or culture or language. Until the Roman Church of about the 12th and 13th century, whether you were Muslim or Orthodox Christian out of Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire, or any of the other ethnicities, there was no religious or political or cultural conflict in the way of trying to enforce how other people thought and how other societies were organized. They all coexisted together. In Jerusalem, for instance, you had, even though it was Muslim, you had Western Roman churches, you had Byzantine churches, you had all sorts of different religion and ethnicities together. You had the same thing in Sicily, in southern Italy, the same thing in Spain. It was universal. The whole mentality of these early epochs was completely different from that of today. And economic historians assume that there's only one mentality. Everybody's greedy and wants to get rich by taking something from somebody else and exploiting them. That was considered asocial behavior, and even though you had even down through Greece and Rome, aristocrats getting rich, they didn't do it conspicuously. They had their slaves or freedmen manage their wealth for all of that. So we're dealing with a different ethic of how a society or economy should be run.
Mhm. Randy, please go ahead with your
Yeah, that is fascinating, Michael. It's my question goes to the difference, the contrast and evolution, I guess, over the years of the concept of the private ownership of property from the ancients up until what we presume is our sense of propriety today.
Today's concept of ownership really comes down to the right to lose it. The right to the ownership means you have the right to forfeit it to your creditors
Right.
and lose your assigned land tenure that society has decided was the way of preserving economic balance. So ownership really means the majority of people losing their property, losing their wealth, losing their labor to a few exploiters at the top. The word it's not appropriate to talk about land ownership in that sense. I'll talk about that in a minute. It was land tenure. It was the terms on which families had access to the land. There was ownership of urban real estate of houses. That was very different from the land.
Yeah.
The agricultural land was distributed, and families were assigned land tenure on it. And even though they could temporarily have to turn over the crops, or which essentially meant the yield of the land,
Right.
that would be returned to them. But society had no problem at all with individuals owning townhouses. And so the clean slates that were proclaimed by the rulers only applied to debts that were owed in grain, not debts that were denominated in silver. So the ownership was part of the basically the foreign trade sector, the mercantile sector. And the mercantile sector was closely intertwined with the large institutions, the palace and the temples that would consign goods to them, and the private. The most foreign trade was organized by private enterprise. There was a lot of private enterprise in Sumer, Babylonia, and throughout the Near East. But that was you could go bankrupt. You could lose if you made a bad deal with as a merchant. You could lose your townhouse, but as a citizen, you still had your own plot of land assigned to you. And so the reason that rulers didn't have to annul silver debts, didn't have to say, well, you have to return the townhouse and urban real estate to you, is every citizen had this protection on the land of themselves. So the economic surplus, largely in silver and foreign trade, was accumulated, and that was where the free market was. And in that free market, you could have its own prices for grain, so that you could have prices go up and down in times of shortage and during the crop year. But during the whole year, this up and down prices would be for prices among members of the community at large, or members of the mercantile class. But the interaction between the two sectors, the palace sector and the community, their payments and credit were kept stable.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy, too. When you describe an earlier period of time, Professor Hudson, things are well balanced, and as we get down to Greek and Roman times, things are ill balanced. People are in trouble. Serfdom and slavery is up, and there's problems. If you were to be somebody in ancient society, would you want to live at 2400 BC, 1800 BC, or 500 BC?
Well, I'd always want to live as late as I could. It was very hard living under in the earliest times, very hard living in Stone Age. The development of agriculture really made people work much harder. The pre-agriculture society, hunting and gathering, has been called the first leisure society. It was very easy to work then. Once you had agriculture, that was hard work. Once you had building up cities and urban areas and all of the construction work that went with it, that was hard work. Once you had planting and harvesting, that was hard work. So that was very difficult. And yet, the people accepted that as, well, that's the way that we have to live because there isn't an alternative. Well, by Greece and Rome by 500 BC, there began to be an alternative, and that was to become a chieftain or a warlord or a creditor. I mentioned that the earlier economies in the East, the Middle East, had two sectors, the large institutions and the economy. But when Greece and Rome emerged from the Bronze Age collapse, they didn't. They had temples, but they basically had local chieftains controlling local cities, and these chiefdoms have been called mafias, mafia-like families that just tyrannized the rest of the land, and they were very sort of rigid. Almost all of these chieftains in one Greek city-state after another, from Sparta and Corinth, finally in Athens, they were all overthrown by what we would call democrats. They were called tyrants. They were usually minor members of the aristocratic families themselves, but not the leading aristocratic members. They said, look, why should the family bosses have everything? You know, we want our bit, and the only way they could achieve what they wanted and not just be as oppressed as the rest of the population was to take the population into their camp, as Aristotle said, and overthrow the existing leaders and exile them. And it was the so-called the tyrants, and the tyrant just meant person in charge. I think it was a word that came from Persia. And they essentially they were the new rulers, and it was these reformers who overthrew the mafiosi in control that essentially created public work spending that built up the in Corinth. They built up the ports and the docks in order to do foreign trade. In Sparta, they were trained for military and got rid of money altogether because of how the bad mafiosi rulers had used money to oppose other people. You had essentially a reform movement at that time, and that became gradually it seemed to be a very good way to live. And in one of the best places to live was Rome, because Rome was sort of not very heavily populated, and that's because it was on the Tiber River, and Italian rivers had mosquitoes, and nobody really wanted to live there. It's mosquitoes made people sick. And so the question is, how do these few people that there were a lot of runaways from the Etruscan society, from other mafiosi states in Italy, they ran away. And just like when the Sumerians ran away from bad rulers, they ran into the swamp areas to live. And the swamp area was always an area for the refugees and the people fleeing. Rome became an area of refugees. And so the leaders, the kings of Rome, said, okay, let's make a virtue of the fact that we have plenty of land, we want labor. What do we do? Well, they made the same kind of arrangement in early Rome that the Near Eastern realms had made. They're saying, if you come to us, bring your any wealth you have with you, bring your military equipment, bring your cattle if you want, whatever you have. If you come, we're going to assign you a plot of land. You can live on it. You can support yourself. You can become a Roman citizen, and we're not going to exploit you in the way that these other Italian cities states exploit you. And so there was more and more of an influx of labor into Rome. You could say it sort of was the way that New York City or America was to Europe, with immigrants fleeing their own countries. And that lasted on the kings, according to the Roman historians, all sort of kept the oligarchy in power. Well, by the late 6th century, by around 509 BC, you had some of the wealthy aristocrats from these mafiosi states going into Rome, and certainly the historian Theodor Mommsen thought that some aristocrats from Etruria were especially bad, and said, "Well, I'm bringing my money here. Hey, some of you guys have money too. Let's overthrow the kings and make an oligarchy, and then we can take over this city just like we took over these mafia states, but we'll share it among ourselves as an aristocracy, and we just will not give any more free lunch to the population at large." And there was essentially they drove out the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, and established an oligarchy that was so cruel that almost immediately the Roman population said, "Well, we peopled Rome by emigrating to here. Now we're going to do the same to leave. Goodbye, we're emigrating." And that was the cessation of the plebs. They moved outside of Rome, maybe 5 or 10 miles. And the question is, what are they going to do now? Well, where are we going to go? There's less and less land now available for settling than there was before. Can we really make it? And they tried. So they tried. They were given promises. Well, come. The oligarchy said, "We'll come back to Rome. We'll be nice to you." And the plebs came back, and the oligarchy was not nice to it. And it got even worse. There was another secession a half century later. They drew up the 12 tables of laws that were pretty much pro-creditors. And again, the oligarchy broke its word. And from about 450 BC on, you had political assassination occurring. If there was an aristocrat that wanted to stand up for the people at large and said, "Look, this is you've got to have much more freedom so we can grow better," he was killed by the aristocracy, and Rome got worse and worse and more unfree. It's like you had a lot of Donald Trumps as rulers there, and things deteriorated fairly rapidly. So 500 BC was, well, let's say 510 BC was nicer. Before the overthrow to live in Rome. In other countries, it all depends how much overcrowded they were. In the Jewish lands, there was a revolution against the oligarchy. The wealthy families and the Jewish population that had been sent to Babylonia after Babylon conquered Judea, learned about the laws of Hammurabi and said, "Well, let's go back and redistribute the land to the original owners." Well, we were the original owners before being wealthy. The Babylonians took us and put us in Babylon. Let's go back and say we're restoring land to the original owners. That's us. Well, you can imagine Marco Rubio and the Cubans trying to go back to Cuba and saying, "Give us back our family land," sort of like a lot of Russians would like their old lands and palaces back that they had under the Tsar. And but in the process, they wrote the laws of Hammurabi, the clean slate, into the very core of Mosaic law in Leviticus, as if Moses himself had announced these clean slates and debt cancellation from the very beginning of Judaism. Not something that modern Judaism or Zionism has much interest in supporting.
Thank you, Professor Hudson. John, please go ahead.
Yeah, Michael, thanks so much for all of this, but I have a question, and that is this period in the Bronze Age of the clean slates from about 2400 to 1400 before the Common Era, that lasted at least 1,000 years, and that's an impressive period of time. And what is not clear to me is what brought that to an end in the Mesopotamian region? If it was so good, why did it fall apart?
Bad weather. All over. They've done ice core experiences. There was a huge drought. First of all, there was around 1800 BC, you had North India, the Indus civilization, had such a bad drought that the population just radically shrunk. And that's when you had the Indo-European speakers move in from basically the Ukraine and became the ruling class. But there also, they adopted the Indus religious practices, apparently including yoga, including how to set a city. Indus civilization was the most standardized of all the ancient civilizations. Even the bricks size throughout the entire Indus empire, that was the largest, we call it an empire, the largest group of all in antiquity. Everything was standardized. And the Peabody Museum, which is Harvard's anthropology department, has an ancient Sanskrit text of how to design a city. Here are so many cultivators, so many administrators, so many, I won't say shoemakers, but everything was, you had to have it in balance. And it was a very well regulated civilization. They had the most sophisticated indoor plumbing of all, not really like modern India. So that was that bad weather. Bad weather began there. By 1600 BC, you had more really, really bad weather that put populations in motion. They couldn't make a living on their own land. The crops were failing from drought largely. And so the Hittites moved in and conquered Babylonia. And that's when you had basically 4 or 5 centuries of very little innovation occurred. Not very much new writing or economic laws occurred. It became sort of a dark age. And then finally, by 1200 BC, you had really bad weather throughout the entire Middle Eastern region, all around the Eastern Mediterranean, Palestine, the whole area there, Lebanon, and you had the sophisticated palace economies of Greece, the Mycenaean civilization. All of the palace economies that were very well organized with linear B writing. They were still chieftainships, but a chieftainship that at least was working. The central rulership fell apart. And so you had, in these palace economies, we'd call it local factory managers. Something happened like the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. The local land managers, factory managers, and administrators just sort of kept ruling under their own name, and there was sort of a free-for-all between 1200 BC and about, let's say, 750 BC, when there's just the absence of written records almost entirely. We have surviving oral poetry of Homer and other epics, and we have the faces and we have the artwork, and we can see that funeral art became more and more elaborate. You could see that there was a concentration of wealth, but we don't know the terms. And written records really pick up with the emergence of the tyrants overthrowing these oligarchies and creating the Greek takeoff, Corinth, Sparta, and finally Athens, sort of a late
So,
comer.
so Michael, what the answer that you've given to my question is that the Age had its own climate crisis.
Yes, yes,
Interesting.
yes, that's what did it. Because if you have bad climate and a drought or floods, the crops fail, and that means the population says we can't live here anymore. We're not able to make a living. They emigrate, and that became history calls them the Sea Peoples. We know that they were the Hittites, certainly from what's now central Turkey, Anatolia, into Babylonia. You had populations in movement all during this, and this was like an intermediate period. And the intermediate period means it's just everyone for himself. You had warlords, you had civic leaders, you had community groups, presumably acting in their own interest under rulers who supported them all. It's by Dark Age, it means there's no literary evidence to tell you exactly what was happening. All you know is that it was dark when it comes to the existence of written records and statistics.
One of the things that strikes me in your description is that society in the Bronze Age was not a democracy as we think about it in terms of people voting and this sort of thing. It was, in a sense, an oligarchy, but it was an oligarchy that cared for its people, that understood it could not survive itself without caring for its people. Is that correct?
I don't like to call it an oligarchy because an oligarchy is acting in its own self-interest against the economy at large. That's why I said before, there isn't really a good word for it except the palatial, it's called the palatial economy. And you had the interpretation of this Near Eastern period distorted for many years by the ex-communist, ex-Stalinist Karl Wittfogel saying irrigated civilizations are despotic. That's the origin of Stalinism. Well, that's just crazy. And his examples all actually were from non-irrigated societies like Persia and other non-irrigated places. There's a belief that if you have central control, you're not going to have Milton Friedman and Margaret Thatcher in control. You can't have a central power, then you're not going to have the oligarchy. You're not going to have Chase Manhattan Bank and Obama protecting the banking sector and evicting 8 million American families in order to keep the financial rentier class going. So it's not that kind of a democracy.
Right. Thanks very much, Michael.
Thanks. These are all the good questions. The more general you ask, the better, because then I can sort of use it as a takeoff point.
Stephen, you're muted.
Sorry, Nelson, please give us your question.
Professor Hudson, good day to you. In your latest article regarding Trump's destruction of the U.S. economy, you talk about how he's created a perfect storm for U.S. agriculture. Speaking of agriculture, can you talk about this crisis? Do you see this as a potential to grow local agricultural economies coming out of this crisis? And how can we translate that crisis into a local food systems not dependent on long supply chains?
Well, agriculture today isn't what it was in the early Bronze Age. It's agribusiness, basically. Large plantations, the large owners. I think now the former head of, sorry, I'm talking too loud. I'll have to talk. So the head of Microsoft is one of the largest landowners in the United States. A lot of the multi-billionaires are buying up U.S. land. That's not what early agriculture was. The Roman Empire, when it decayed into serfdom, it turned into large plantations and serfdom. So that was that kind of agriculture. Essentially, the farming class in the United States is not the farming class that it was at the time of the American Revolution. They're very dependent. You have the large marketing corporations, Cargill, for instance, and Archer, Midland Daniels, essentially raking off most of the farm income. They have to borrow against the crops and they have to sell their crops beforehand. And essentially, agriculture has been financialized in the modern world. You had all of the cultivators had to run into debt during the crop year to have credit, but it wasn't financialized by an independent financial interest acting in its own interest as you have today. You had the palace governing and balancing the agricultural conditions, as opposed to now Trump saying, quite happy to sacrifice the farmers in order to help his campaign contributors, the crop financiers, the seed manufacturers and monopolies, whose interests are not those of the farmers. The railway monopoly that's being created by the mergers that's going to increase the prices. The massive closing down of hospitals in the rural areas, as hospitals in the farming sectors cannot remain solvent under today's conditions, or they're bought out by private equity firms. So you have the whole idea of agriculture really being just an appendage of the financial sector, not really part of the agricultural sector. It's been absorbed by the financial sector and is something quite different. And the financial sector has pretty much taken over control of economic planning and tax policy and transportation policy and health policy and credit policy in the United States. So you have the antithesis of how society took off, and the result is that we're doing just the opposite today.
And how do you think that this could be a moment for translating it into more local agriculture, more cultural local food systems? That way, obviating, the problem with long supply chains and now or in the future.
Well, even if you're local, how are you going to market the crops? You're sort of dependent on the Archer, McDaniel, all of the companies that have monopolized the wholesalers that have purchased the crops and market them. You can go to farmers markets, but I notice here in New York, the farmers markets have to charge very high prices in order to make a go of it, and their prices are much higher than you get in the chain stores or Trader Joe's or Aldi's or one of the companies that can buy from co-ops or other groups that are smaller. So the problems cannot be solved locally. You need a economy-wide restructural, would have to say, revolution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Appreciate your work very much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll try to get a book question in or two. But one of the things, Michael, you've been describing now is sort of like in debt forgiveness, there's a central leadership, a palace leadership, and the laborer. And they sort of have this bond. And then in the middle, you have administrators and chiefs wanting to make a buck or do well. And it seems like going from the early Bronze Age down is the continuous breakdown between the leadership, the palace, the emperors, the Caesars, everyone, and the laborers. Is that a good characterization then?
Yes, that's
Hmm.
exactly it. There is the breakdown, and personal opportunism takes up, and there are always antisocial personalities that want to take over. But in much of the role of what you could call ancient religion was a kind of ethic that it was socially improper to be very selfish. The way to attain status was to become a philanthropist. If you had wealth, you would yourself pay for the development of some conspicuous city urban need. You would achieve status by helping the economy grow, not by impoverishing other people. Today's economic status and social approval depends on the more people you can impoverish and evict from their houses and turn into debt peons, the higher your status is because you're successful. And that's what economics is all about. We're taught in school, and Jesus is going to make you rich. The prosperity gospel says just hurt everybody that you can and take what you can. That's what Jesus wants, because if you do that, it means God's on your side. That's what Christianity has turned into today.
Hmm. Michael, let me go back and run away to classical Greece for a moment. You have Solon the Wise, and he's setting a foundation of, I would like to say, democracy in terms of the jury, in terms of setting up inheritance laws, that you had to spread out your wealth upon your death. And then this gives rise to the classical enlightened period. Why did they not figure this out? It seems like they had the information all over them. They
Wait,
were
who's the they?
Aristotle and I in Stephen Zerlanga's book, for example, there's a picture of Aristotle and Alexander the Great as a young man learning from him. And what did he learn? How to conquer and war. and but he knew he had to get the bread, he had to get the silver, he was going to go to Egypt first, he was going to get it, versus learning how to create peace and not have to go to war. They missed the Sumerian education of it's better to trade than go to war. And they couldn't see, if they have this quality of wanting to be a philanthropist, but they also are shooting themselves in the foot. They could have gone back to a Sumerian way, perhaps, because if they can't do it, then we have to do it today. We have to somehow make a social democracy, a democratic socialism, referring to your Destiny of Civilization book. We have to make things work today. And why couldn't they do it in classical Greece?
Well, I'm sure that Donald Trump went to church when he heard a lot of sermons, saying about love thy neighbor and help that. But look at what happened to him. Alexander the Great was himself, and I think, you have a bill-shaped curve among individuals. You have from one end. Oops, they've inverted my strain. You have all sorts of individuals, and Alexander the Great, I don't think, was following a plan that Aristotle advised him in. So you can't blame that. That was he was
It was his father,
Macedonian. I mean,
the
he
Philip.
came from the north of Greece. Remember, he wasn't an Athenian. He came from the north of Greece, so he kept his native cultural values with him. And Aristotle was sort of a celebrity teacher, but we don't know. Teaching philosophy doesn't mean how you're going to behave as you're in a position to inherit control of an army and wealth to conquer other people. So you can't blame that. that you had the ability of individuals to be conquerors. You had many leaders in that epoch trying to be local conquerors and leaders. The opportunity arose because there were, as a society got wealthier, it could afford to have large fortunes appropriated in the hands of wealthy families. Economies with a low economic surplus could not afford inequality because there wasn't enough income and output and crops and food and wealth to go around to afford any class being particularly wealthy. So their form of wealth would be, oh, you'd have some high status, a piece of clothing, or a possession of one of your ancestors or a famous citizen in your possession. You would have shells and decorations that you would get in foreign trade, but you were expected, if you got wealth and the low surplus communities that anthropologists study, you were expected, if you had wealth, you didn't found a dynasty and an oligarchy with it. The wealth was either buried with you, or at your funeral it would all be used to have a great big feast so that everybody could celebrate you, or you could have a feast for them to celebrate your ancestors and then get somehow status and credit for that. But the idea is it was considered bad form to accumulate wealth in an epoch when people thought that if somebody's wealthy, they've got this wealth by exploiting and impoverishing other people. Well, as science and technology and productivity increased, you had the ability of people to get wealthy on their own, and that wealth was turned into a means of power, including military power, the power to buy supporters, to buy yes men around you, to buy gangs of people that you would mobilize and act on your behalf. So, part of that is a byproduct of technological and economic advance, not a decision, let's change our morality and decide to become greedy.
Okay. Let me go to just a short stop over to Sparta. And remember, in Plutarch, Lycurgus is setting up his society there, and Plutarch describes Pelennors as being the Spartan money, but archaeologically we found very few or none of them. I'm not sure. And do you have any more recent information on any kind of Spartan money? A few minutes ago you said there's really no Spartan money. What did Pelennors exist or not? Do you know?
I'm sure they did. There's no reason to think that somebody would have just made that up. But because they didn't really have commodity value, there was no reason for people to save them. They didn't think, let's save them to be put in some museum. So 2,000 years later, people will know what we were doing. That wasn't on their mind. The whole idea was that this Lycurgus, or whoever the leaders were, said, we've seen interest-bearing debt and money, the greed for money, the money love, become a destabilizing factor. Let's just get rid of it. Let's make an economy where people don't need money. Everything is going to be settled. Well, unfortunately, they got this money by saying we're going to conquer a neighboring population and make them helots, and they're going to have to work as helot serfs to feed us. But all of this was managed economy. It wasn't that didn't have to deal with money, although it was mutual obligation economy. And there was it was a standardized economy and not a very pleasant place to live, I don't think.
Yeah. Let's jump over later on towards the end of your book. You have the nobles, the clergy in particular, in this case, becoming strong in Constantinople, and they're beginning, it's the last hurrah for debt forgiveness. And because Constantinople then becomes weak, it's going to be gullible, or it's going to be vulnerable to Venice, or the Crusades. And what is happening then in these last years from Rome to Constantinople to the end of this period of debt forgiveness? And there's a breakdown of society totally in Rome, and the Dark Ages begins. Do you have any last thoughts on things petering it out? And then how might we bring it back again, of course?
Well, the Dark Age was largely in Western Europe. Byzantium was doing quite well. It was because it was the Eastern Roman Empire, it was part of the Roman Empire. And that meant there were large landowning families that had huge estates. They had dependent labor, but they didn't have the extreme collapse that there was in the West. And there was always a tension between the emperor, who acted as a central regulating figure, trying to prevent the Byzantine Empire. The word Byzantine Empire didn't come in until about the 13th, 14th century, but to prevent Eastern Roman Empire from being torn apart. And they would do what they could by tax policy and by supporting the people against the large landowners who were able to use their quasi-serfs and cultivators and dependent labor as their own army to fight against any central power in Constantinople able to conquer them. And indeed, there was a war, I think, around the 10th century of the local oligarchs against the emperor. And fortunately, Byzantine emperor won. And he invited the leader of the general who'd been working for the oligarchy to a big feast to try to say, okay, we're going to have peace now. We're going to celebrate. Let's have a big meal together. And he turned to the general and said, how do we prevent this from happening again? We know that there are a lot of families that are ambitious. They'd like to be emperor. They'd like to overthrow me or my successors and be the new Roman Empire. How do I prevent that? And the general said, tax them away, cut off their power. Don't let them get rich. If you let them get rich, they're going to be addicted to money. They're going to use their wealth to try to turn it into political and military power. And that's what wealth addiction is. And there was still this perception that was central to Athenian drama, to Greek literature, and even into Roman literature, that wealth is addictive. They had their own words for money love, something like, I don't know, silverphilia, something like that. That you couldn't avoid it. And that's why Socrates said, if you want to have a good ruler, which is wrongly called a philosopher king by people who really hate what Socrates was really writing about. Socrates said, you want a ruler that doesn't put getting rich and money love first. You want a ruler that doesn't have a fortune or a big estate of his own, so he's not going to support laws that support the money lending class and the landowning class. You're going to have somebody who's not subject, who hasn't caught the wealth addiction disease. Well, in a way, that was what the general told the Byzantine ruler, that you have to do that. Do not let personal fortunes be accumulated by families that are ambitious to make their own dynasties. So since it's 3:15, I'm going to have to leave in 15 minutes. So the second part of your question was, what do we do to avoid that today? And I thought about it after we talked earlier today. Only a strong government is a strong ruler of some form can override this combination of rentier, landed and financial interest that seeks to take over society in a way that not that serves itself, but in serving its own greed, ends up impoverishing society and ultimately bankrupting the economy that it had hoped would make them rich. So today's world is we're seeing a fight once again between, you could say, democracy and oligarchy, if you're talking about Western politics, opposing the oligarchy from Greece and Rome. Reformers all called for land redistribution and cancellation of the debts. My book, Collapse of Antiquity, describes the constant civil warfare, 500 years of civil warfare, advocating debt cancellation, land redistribution, so that everybody would have the means of self-support instead of becoming financially dependent for their housing and their food and for their basic needs. And today's economy is all designed to offer opportunities by wealthy people to deprive consumers and employees and the population at large from being able to meet their basic needs, education, healthcare, food, housing, out of their own resources without going into debt that grows and grows and makes them even more dependent on the banking class and the financial class and the landlord class and on the monopolies. So the whole concept of creating a society without a rentier class, without the idle rich whose income is not earned, but is merely a transfer payment from society to the rent recipients. You've lost the whole essence of what classical economics in the 19th century was all about. The concept of, yes, you have this exploitative ruling class emerge, but it emerges by not by investing and employing labor to make a profit, but by extracting economic rent, by establishing privileges. That's what makes today's society just the opposite of what the classical economists were trying to do in the 19th century. You have you had the whole spirit of industrial capitalism being, we want a strong enough government to undertake construction of basic infrastructure so that the transportation, free healthcare, free education, communication, so that we don't have to pay our employees enough money, so they have to pay for high-priced housing, high-priced food, high-priced healthcare, high-priced all the other things that are today. And you had from Ricardo to Marx the idea that that rent recipients, the demand for rent was going to essentially siphon off so much money for the idle rich, for the rentier class, that there would be no room for industrial profits to be made anymore. Ricardo stated this very explicitly. And of course, Marx picked it up and said it's not simply because of land rent, it's because of monopoly rent and financial rent and the whole financial dynamic and monopoly dynamic of industrial capitalism was turning into by the late 19th century. So when it comes to things like land tenure, to get back to how we begin, you have finance and other economic structures and politics. Money has ended up as the central planner because if it's the banks that have the ability to create credit, to create money that's accepted as payment of taxes, they can create the credit, and by deciding who's going to get the credit. What are they going to use it for? That's economic planning. And if the whole objective of this emerging financial finance capitalist oligarchy is to prevent a strong government from developing, to prevent a government strong enough to prevent them from impoverishing the economy at large by their greed. Oligarchies want weak governments. Unless they're controlled by the oligarchy itself, in which case you have something like Rome's patrician Senate or the American Democratic and Republican Party today, controlled by the donor class.
No. Thank you. Thank you for that, Michael. Do you have, we have 9 minutes. Did you want to try to take a question?
Sure.
First, actually, John has been waiting earlier on. I mean, John Root. And John, go ahead. And then Joe, maybe if we get you in real quick too.
One of the things that Zarlenga describes in his book is the gold-silver ratio, which was being exploited at the time of Babylon. I was wondering if you had anything to say about that, because I use that as a vector by which the rentier class was able to continually stay ahead of the law.
What, the gold-silver ratio?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. Hardly anybody knows about it.
No, in
I know
India,
about it, but I don't see the point you're making. It remained.
Well, the Rodenites in Babylon, who were exploiting exploiting the gold silver arbitrage, had a continuous source of unearned income that allowed them to, in secret, basically, become the rulers, just like we have now.
Well, silver was the money. Gold really wasn't money. It was a form of wealth accumulation, but it was controlled the nouveau riche. And when we see, for instance, the Ur-3 tombs, where you see gold jewelry beginning to be buried with the dead bodies, it's like these were the barbarians liked silver, but the more balanced, civilized economies. I mean, the barbarians like gold, uh, and that was considered nouveau riche. Uh, it was not so much of a monetary commodity; it's just a different form of wealth. So it's like going into debt to buy an Andy Warhol etching or something like that, an artwork. You could make money by borrowing on arbitrage. I can't think of any cuneiform documents about such trades. I'm not aware of any in early Mesopotamian times.
okay.
So there's some more research for me to do.
If it exists, you can search.
Okay, Joe Polito.
Well, that was terrific, Professor, as always. Given your history of developing and supporting the Chicago Plan, could you draw a line here, connect the lines between these deficiencies then and now, and how the Chicago Plan, the NEAT Act, could address and provide some solutions to this situation?
Well, to make a long story short, the Chicago Plan wanted to do essentially what China's been able to do. How do you create credit to serve the public interest of overall prosperity? And the Chicago Plan advocated 100% reserves by commercial banks, meaning it wanted to turn banks into savings banks. They couldn't create credit. They could only lend out money that they already had on deposit. Well, the question was, how was industry and going to be financed under this? Was there enough money? Well, the answer is that yes, you could still have banks trying to make money on loans. Where are they going to get the money from besides their depositors to finance heavy industry and aircraft manufacture and things like that? Well, they'd get it. The Treasury would say, well, we will deposit give you a depository credit in exchange for buying loans for you that are from purposes that we consider to be productive social purposes, like financing tangible capital investment to build factories to employ labor. That's good. But we're not going to give you create public credit money to as deposits and to finance your loans for corporate takeovers or loans for corporate share buybacks to increase your stock price. We're not going to provide you with the credit to engage in predatory, unproductive lending. We will, if you want to act as economic planners, we will only provide a credit and help you make loans that are for a productive purpose that is deemed to increase the economy, pretty much along the same industrial lines that China is trying to create the economy, hopefully without a real estate over lending crisis that China did. So basically, that the purpose of the Chicago plan, realizing that, well, you're not going to get rid of the commercial banks. Certainly, as a transition period, you have to deal with the reality that there are commercial banks making credit. All we can do is we're not going to give them the privilege of credit creation out of on their computers or by the stroke of the pen. They'll have to be like savings banks, and only the government can create credit money, not private banks, because the power to create credit money is the power to allocate the economy's resources, and the banking sector does not do a good job of this, leaving credit creation in their own hands.
Thank you so much for that. Simon Johnson, Nobel Prize winner Simon Johnson, doesn't go as far as you, but he's in a similar place in his book Jumpstarting America, and he also addresses. He says we should be using the World War II approach, the generous use of public money and public-private partnerships, and producing things like you described, focus on investment, and he says that China's been doing that and we haven't. And you're even better, you're saying China's using almost the Chicago plan and we're not. And I think you're completely right. So thanks again for that clarifying description.
I'm glad you brought up that question, because that's the key question, and that's what the common denominator of all these conferences has been about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have one more question, and then my super's coming to fix up our radiators.
Well, it may be just a great thank you. And I just want to mention we have Destiny of Civilization and the Collapse of Antiquity are two more of Michael's books. And if there was the last question is finance capitalism, industrial capitalism, or socialism. And I was wondering, any thoughts about democratic socialism? And is there any like in between routes, say we as monetary reformers, say between BRICS and this fallen apart this failed Western system?
I want to avoid the word democracy. Democracy is what they have in the Ukraine under Zelensky. You kill everybody who doesn't agree with you. You hate your enemies. You establish a totalitarian dictatorship. Democracy is what you have in where a genocide is not taking place right now. Everywhere that Pinochet was supported in Chile as a democracy. The word democracy has been so degraded that I want to avoid it. It's a code word for military dictatorship under the control of U.S. and the financial sector.
Thank you, Michael. I'm learning all the time, and I did it. That's a good 1-2 blow to it. So we've neoliberalism and all of these other terms and what is a liberal and I'm trying to come up with language. As we lacked language for the past, we lack language for today too. And so,
Well, it's
yeah,
been a good discussion. I look forward to reading the transcript of it all.
very good.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. And Michael, we reached 80 people, so it was well attended. So
Thanks all for joining, folks.
Thanks very much.
thank you.